Hello. Welcome to another Austin Software Co-op meetup. Today's topic is on fairness. Watson is going to be sharing, he shared another paper and be going through it here in a moment. This is going to be talking about fair division and ethics with regard to compensation and all sorts of other things that can be applied to trying to be equitable within a group. And we'll be referencing stuff like self-organizing groups and capitalism and contrasting all those. You ready to get going, Watson?
Okay. Thanks. All right. Fairness is it's a controversial subject because people kind of think that it's a thing that can't be obtained. So it's an interesting thing to try to research. It's something that I've been researching for a while now. So what we're going to do is a two-part I guess, paper or a two-part session on fairness. The first part is just going to be about the basic components of fairness. The second part is going to be about implementing those specific components within a cooperative setting or a professional services company setting. So the first part of fairness that I'd like to talk about, the first part of the paper is going to be about kind of breaking things down into four components. So psychology, and then some of the more controversial portions of fairness, which would be saying that there are things within fairness that are objective, and then the less controversial is things, isolating those things that are subjective and denoting those things. And then talking about the strategy of fairness. So the first part here, the introduction, the problem of fairness is known as a problem of fair division among game theorists. And it's a mix of psychology and strategy. And like I said, the common intuition about fairness procedures is that every procedure can be gamed. People normally think that you can game any type of fairness. And in some sense, that's true in like a strict game theoretic sense. So there's a way to min-max any type of game so that you can ensure a certain outcome. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can exploit other people. There are certain types of procedures that, given the definitions that we're going to talk about, they're kind of unexploitable. They can give certain guarantees. Fairness is also, it's really difficult to, I don't want to say really difficult, but it's non-trivial to reason about fairness. If you want to treat fairness like a bike shed, and that everybody has an opinion, there's no way to coherently reason about it and stuff like that. Yeah, it's going to be difficult. But I'm going to outline some basic components of fairness, some objective components that you can use as tools to reason about it. And essentially, there are many things that can be considered fair or not fair. What we're going to be talking about here are ways to distribute results or outcomes or payoffs. So that's the type of fairness we're going to talk about here. All right, so fairness, the psychology of fairness can be separated into three portions. The two main ones are the rational and the irrational. The rational side, that portion is going to be the part that is the most useful as far as what you can do to make sure that fairness is coherent or internally consistent, those types of things. The irrational side is more, it has more to do with exploitation and how people get exploited. So let's delve into that. So game theorists define rationality in a specific way. Rationality, or it can be ambiguous. Sometimes people use the term rationality as synonymous with just logic, and it's not necessarily that. So rationality is just choosing your preferences. So if you prefer apples over oranges and you're hungry, all things considered, if you have an apple and an orange in front of you, if you choose the apple, then you were being rational. If you choose the orange, all things considered, and you prefer apples over oranges, no other things to mess around with the preference, then you were being irrational. So it's a very simple concept, but it can be confusing if you confuse it with Aristotelian logic or some other type of logic. And then an irrational decision is essentially that same, the inverse of what I previously said. So irrational decisions can occur for many different reasons, but you might say, well, why in the world would somebody choose against their own preference? Well, you can consciously say that you like apples over oranges, but then subconsciously prefer oranges over apples. And then that's what opens Pandora's box. So we do irrational decisions all the time. And that's going to come into play later when we talk about strategies. All right, so now we're going to talk about the objective portion of fairness. This is probably a little bit more controversial to try to say that something can be fair and be objectively fair. It's kind of controversial. So what I mean by that is you can record someone's preferences. You can record how someone values a certain payoff. And you can record the allocations that a group of people were given. So because after something is recorded, then it's objective. And that's what I mean by that. When you record a thing, now you can apply all types of algorithms to it, and you can reason about it in an objective way. That's where game theory shines, is modeling those types of things. Are there any questions?
It's all pretty straightforward. So far, it makes sense.
Okay. Cool. All right. I'm going to go ahead and skip up to, I guess this is important. Evaluation is a person's utility received from an allocation. A person can have a belief of evaluation of what an allocation is worth to themselves, of what it's worth to others. So basically, you can believe that on a scale of 1 to 10, something is worth a 9 to yourself. You can also have certain beliefs about what someone else values an object. That's a little confusing. It's different than a preference. Preference is just an ordering. Something is worth more than another thing. So here's subjective. This is what, when people think of fairness, they often think of the subjective component of fairness. And I split it into psychological, emotional, and then again, valuations. So this can be tricky, separating what's subjective and what's objective. I'm going to read this out. Even though we can document a person's preferences and valuations, this does not guarantee that we know the causes of those positions. The causes of preference orderings and valuations are normally considered subjective and personal. There are a number of psychological and emotional factors that can drive preferences and valuations. Some of these factors can have an effect on the overall motivation of a person involved with seeking or not seeking fairness. So that's just to account for when people are saying, well, what is it that's subjective about a fairness procedure? It's the causes of preference orderings and valuations. Now, after you already say, okay, I prefer apples to oranges, at that point, now that's recorded. Now that can become objective and be reasoned about, stuff like that. Now that we understand objective components of a fairness procedure and fairness reasoning, and then also subjective, now we can actually talk about the components of a fairness procedure. There are 5 major components of fairness, and those are proportionality, efficiency, envy-freeness, equitability, and manipulability. Right, so being able to manipulate something or procedure. So proportionality it's kind of like what people normally think of what fairness is. The first thought that comes to mind is, oh, everything's equal. And that's also called egalitarianism. And it's a misconception, or it's a naive view of fairness. It's also what people will use to argue against making things fair. If you are preoccupied with making things fair and you bring that subject up, people often think that you are trying to make things egalitarian. So proportionality simply means, within the game theorist view, everyone that's involved within the allocation, the distribution of the results, gets one N, where N is the number of players. So they all get this equal portion, basically. That's proportionality. It's a concept that's useful to understand and know because you apply it with the other components. But by itself, it just simply is being egalitarian. So the next component is efficiency. And this is the most difficult component to understand, but it's not really that difficult if you kind of break it down. Efficiency has a strong intuition within Western culture and within Americans specifically, especially. We do not like leaving things on the table. We do not like someone else losing money or losing some type of reward if that reward wasn't going to go to anyone else. It was just out there. So if someone just has to, if they have to decrease themselves, even though everyone else stays the same, we really don't like that. The easiest way to think about it is just leaving things on the table. If you were to cut a cake, if there's 3 people and you were to cut a cake 4 ways and you gave each person 3 pieces of the cake and there was 1 extra piece there, that type of fairness procedure, we don't like that. We would probably pick any other thing. We would randomly give 1 person 1 piece of the cake it would be better than just leaving it there if people were hungry or whatever. So that's how strong, that's why it's very important to understand efficiency if you're going to try to talk about fairness with people that are, Westerners, because they will not accept what you come up with if you don't. So the concept to understand is the Pareto optimality. So the easiest way to understand that is you can say that there's a distribution. Let's say that something needed to be split up. So that's called an allocation. So an allocation was just given to a bunch of people. Right. If that allocation, say that the allocation, just call it allocation A. If there are no other allocations where one person does better and every other person does at least as well, then the allocation that you gave is Pareto optimal. That means nothing else is left on the table. But it's just a more rigorous way to describe it. The reason why you need to describe it that way is that there can be many Pareto optimal distributions. Okay, some people doing better, some people doing worse, whatever. But there can't be something where one person could do better and everyone else do the same. Very important. Envy freeness is the next component. It's when a person perceives that their allocation is tied with the highest allocation. So if a person, it's very simple. I mean, if there were 4 apples to be distributed and there's 2 people and person B got 2 apples and you're person A and you got 2 apples, that means you're tied with the highest allocation. That means that's the definition of envy freeness here. Manipulability is when a fairness procedure allows for a person to increase their allocation merely by knowing the other person's preferences. That can be a little tricky to understand too, but that's kind of what people have an intuition about. Anything can be gamed. It's not necessarily true. There are situations there are fairness procedures that are immune to being manipulated. So you have to go into the study of the different fairness procedures, but it's something to critique when you're looking at a procedure and you see that it can be gamed based off of knowing what someone else's preferences are. Then you know it's weak towards that, and then it could look all good on paper, but it's not fair because people will exploit it. The last component,
Can you scroll down a little bit?
Go ahead.
Scroll down a little bit.
Yeah, the last component is equitability. This one is this is the one that people should be thinking about when they're thinking about fairness. All of these components are important, but this is the one. Normally, people think about proportionality or egalitarianism, but what they really should be thinking about is equitability. Equitability is when a person believes that her valuation of her own allocation is the same as another person's evaluation of their allocation. I give an example here. It's not too complicated. An example would be if it took 3 hours to create a pie, with person A working 2 hours and receiving 2/3 of the pie, while person B works 1 hour and receives 1/3 of the pie. If person A believes person B believes all things are equal, talent, quality of work, risk, and all that, and that an hour work deserves a portion of the pie, then person A believes that the allocation is equitable. That's a very rigorous way of saying it, like all things considered, it's equal. So it's related to egalitarianism in the sense of I'm considering what you think risk is worth. I'm considering what you think your quality is worth. I'm considering all of those things, what you think it's worth. And did you get what is equal? Like you may think that working 2 hours on a pie, the risk for it is not worth it. So you only work 1 hour. And you did that. Okay. Did you get your 1 hour's worth? Okay. And then I got my 2 hours worth. Okay. You know, that's going to be equitability. There are, believe it or not, I mean, there are fairness procedures that can guarantee equitability based off of what someone records as their preferences and their valuations. So it's an objective fairness procedure, and it can be guaranteed to be equitable. There's lots of fairness procedures. Again, game theorists are preoccupied with making things fair. And there's lots of examples of it. And it's been, game theory has only been around for maybe about 60 years, but the examples of fairness and exploitations have been around for thousands of years. So there's lots of study there. So given that part, those 4 components, those things, if you don't remember anything else about the paper, those 5 components, those are the 5 components to remember, those 5 things. The next portion is strategy. People can have kind of like a macro position towards fairness. And this is, again, I put this in here because it can be confusing to think about fairness and then take a step back and say, well, why are things not fair? Or why are things fair? Or why are things, why do some people have a weird strategy? Again, when we're using this term strategy, the strategy is defined as a decision that takes other people's decisions into consideration when being made. So that's an important thing to remember when we're using that word in any of these papers that we're putting forth. What we've outlined previously is it's really kind of like the default strategy for fairness and what someone would normally think of. That would be called just fair division, trying to make things equitable or being preoccupied with those five components. So equitability, envy-freeness, those types of things. Now, exploitation is when you're trying to bring about a situation where people think that the allocations are fair. So consciously, they think that they're fair. But subconsciously, they make decisions that are against their conscious preferences. There are ways to exploit people. And I'm just going off it's not in the paper here, but I'm going off the top of my head. There are ways to exploit people that we've written into law. We made it illegal for you to do these things because they work so well. For instance, there's laws on the books called usury laws. Those laws make it to where if I want to loan Taylor, $10,000, $20,000 right now with a 50% interest rate, it's illegal for me to do that. But guess what? So why do I have to make that illegal? Taylor just lost his mind. Well, guess what? That kind of strategy works. Consciously, you may know 50% or some high interest rate, you could have your whole family tell you, whatever, that it's not a good idea, whatever. But unconsciously, you have things that work against you. It may be that you're hard up for money or whatever. At some point in your life, too many people have run historically in the past thousands of years where people were loaning money. It's not a sustainable situation to where you can allow people to loan money to other people with whatever interest rate they want. That's why usury laws exist. So usury laws are a good example of laws that need to be in place to protect people from other people who exploit, right? And you can say that so trying to reason about it, it seems fair. Hey, they made a conscious decision. If you're a good libertarian, you believe in free markets, they made a conscious decision to accept the 50% interest rate. Well, your whole country breaks when you allow for that, because it's easy to get people into that situation. So I think that's a good example of exploitation. There are much more common examples of exploitation. One of them I use here. You can read the paper, that portion to see it. It's a little bit complicated, but the vast majority of people succumb to that form. The next form, and again, what's interesting about this exploitation is the people that are targets of the exploitation, they actually believe that the system is fair. That's why it's very important to include this when you're thinking about fairness, because you can get confused if you don't. The next is a strategy of like altruism. I think that there are situations where, first, altruism itself is a somewhat controversial subject because some people don't even believe that it exists. You kind of have to. It's an ambiguous word. You have to try to define it. There's a biological definition of altruism that I use in the link here. So inclusive fitness in humans. So basically, one definition of altruism is when someone helps another entity and that entity there's a threshold that's surpassed where that entity's is like genetically not related to you. So you're not trying to pass on your genes. So that's the argument to say that there's an argument to say that altruism doesn't exist because people will go ahead and give resources to other entities, but it's evolution. It's an evolutionary adaptation to pass on your genes. Your genes aren't being altruistic. Well, there are situations where your genes are being altruistic. An example I give here is like the classic Cinderella story. You can take a baseline of someone adopting a child and saving them from poverty, feeding them or whatever. Take that baseline, but they're not treating them like their biological child. And take that same person, and then they can treat the child like they are their biological child. And we see that all the time, right? But we have a phrase, treating someone like a stepchild. That's treating someone less than. So since that discrepancy, that difference between the stepchild and the treatment of the biological child, treating a stepchild like a biological child, that would be altruism. And you can see more about that in the link on the bottom. It's also found in animals and stuff like that. So you can look in the bottom and link in the bottom to see it. As far as a conclusion, when deciding if a procedure for allocation is fair, it is useful to consider its proportionality, efficiency, and the freeness, equitability, and manipulability in an objective manner. It's possible to consider these attributes from an objective standpoint, and even though there are subjective factors for each individual involved. Given that human beings have some level of predictability, both in general and in individual cases, it's possible to adopt a strategy for pursuing some fairness procedure over others. That's all I have. So you guys have any questions? You're just in time, Krista.
We're in the Q&A portion, Krista. So what do you have? Josh. It was good, though. It's pretty short. I mean, once it starts getting in, I found it really easy to comprehend all the topics. And I like it, the breakdown with those 5. I reposted those. Equitability is a really big thing. Like getting that in your mind, the difference. Josh, I think you may have had something.
No, I was just I came right on the climax of the talk. I feel like it was just getting to the good part when I tuned in. From what I heard, I mean, I liked it. I mean, as always, the whole equitability portion. I've never thought about. I mean, I guess like inherently, I've thought about equitability, but never acknowledged it because you always think that you're right when judging yourself, right? And so, I guess in that way, yeah. But to try to hit that marker where the other party actually thinks that this is fair as well. That's a nice place. And so yes, I don't know. I like that part. It's a pretty cool way to look at it.
Yeah, for me, the interesting thing about it is that you can have fairness procedures that guarantee equitability. That almost seems like it would be an impossible thing, but given that people can record their preferences and valuations and things like that, you can make fairness procedures that guarantee them.
I see. I guess I'm gonna have to go back and watch the first half again, take a peek at some of those procedures.
Yeah, I didn't include. I have a link in the paper to the book for the fair division. There's so many procedures. You really have to adapt the procedure to what you're doing. And the types of goods. There's different kinds of goods, and I don't have that in here. But there's divisible goods and indivisible goods, and the number of players in the game or in the situation, 2, 3, 4, or infinite amount, things like that. Those all come into play, and you're trying to get as many of those 5 components as possible. And then when it comes into manipulation, there are situations where you can manipulate it, but only if you're like really, really, really smart. And in real life, it doesn't happen. So there's a level of manipulation, but it doesn't really obtain. But then there's other procedures where you can't manipulate it. There's nothing you can do about it. So it depends on your situation. So that's why I was going to include a bunch of them, but I think it would be more confusing because the really what we want to do, this paper is a setup for the next, which is a fairness procedure within a cooperative. So all the stuff we've been going over for a while now, behind the scenes, we're going to be able to use these tools in this paper to talk about that.
Nice.
Great. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Awesome. Okay, looking forward to part 2 Thanks, Watson. I think we have next year a couple of guest speakers lined up, including someone from Inspiral. Maybe we'll pull someone in from Sassafras or some of the other cooperatives that we're talking with. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining. See you all next time.
Thanks, guys.